Our next speaker is talking about helping teams make fast, effective decisions, with a presentation providing evidence-based research on how teams use sets of data visualizations in communication or visualization to make decisions. We're excited to welcome Dr. Nicola Bateman to the virtual stage here today. With that, I'll hand the floor to Dr. Bateman.
Hello, Outlier 23, and welcome to my office here in Leicester. It's great to be following on from Johnson because my research, which I've been doing for well over 10 years, looks into just the kind of decision making that he was talking about. So I've done work in many sectors, but quite a lot is healthcare based, but also the construction sector that he mentioned as well. So my background is that sits between engineering and business in a discipline called operations management, which includes the kind of supply chain problems that Johnson was also talking about. As such, I don't produce the kind of beautiful visualizations we've been seeing over the last few days. And so you might find some of my aspects of my presentation a bit old school. But the area that I've done my research in is called visual management. And I've been looking at how best to design the kind of data boards that Johnson was talking about to support decision making. So the background to this is really looking at visualizations, both in general management, but also in operations management as well. So visual management is a method to support that kind of decision making in the workplace. And what we're trying to do is to make those decisions faster, because often you're pressure for time, but more insightful as well, i.e. a kind of better quality. And we're also trying to involve more people because the complex decision making we face now often requires input from a wide range of people. And so that's why we're trying to make decisions in teams, and that's a particular focus of my work. Now, I'm going to show you the next slide is one of these kind of visualizations, and you'll find it quite old-fashioned. You can see it's paper-based, and this is an example from a manufacturing company, and it's used by the cell leader. This is the weekly side of the board, and they have a daily side as well. And it helps them decide what to make today, what problems they faced yesterday and how to solve them. It's not a thing of beauty. Its primary purpose is to support the team. Here we're looking at a hand-drawn board. You can see some things are printed out, but quite a lot of the data is added on by hand. And it was designed by the cell leaders to meet their needs. So we have a definition of visual management, and here it is. You'll notice it was written by me. The main reason for that is because there's not many academics working in this field, and so I needed to write some kind of definition. I'll probably update it fairly soon as well, I think. So it's about the use of visual data to manage operations. It's often used to support teams in their decision making. So its purpose is to create a shared vision. And the reason you want a shared vision is you want to move together as a team. And it lets everyone see how well the process or system is operating at a glance. So that's about speed. It's also about managing demand, and that's particularly important in the service organization where you can't physically see demand so easily. One of the major purposes is to enable and promote group discussion so that you get ownership of any decisions and problem solving that you do. And it's also about supporting both individuals and teams in their decision making so they feel confident in what they're doing. It allows them to highlight issues and bottlenecks. And so when I started out this research, I wanted to draw on research and best practice. So I ended up being well outside my home area and looking at materials from graphic design and also from cognitive psychology. And I realized we were a long way from the kind of beautiful data viz designs that we've seen over the last few days. So what I really wanted to do was to understand what makes a good visualization in this context. And this next slide kind of draws on what is probably well known to many of you through David McCandless's work, where he talks about information, story, goal, and visual form. And I use one of his visuals when I'm teaching teams how to design their boards. But I also picked up from Lucas a couple of days ago, who had a variation on this and spoke about purpose, form, insight, and trust. And the trust aspect was really important. That was also highlighted by Johnson and also the questions afterwards. The teams have to trust the data that's on their board, and that's why it's important that they're involved in its development. When we're testing boards and looking for evidence, one of the things we're looking for is what we call facilitated insights. So what we mean by that is, does the way that you have shown the data allow additional insight that the teams might not otherwise garner? Does it also support discourse? So this is about the teams being able to talk together and have a supportive, facilitated discussion. These ideas were derived from a really useful paper by Bresciani, Blackwell, and Epler. There's some references at the end. And if you're working in this area, you might find it useful to have a look at some of their ideas, which are broader than what I've shown here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what I show the teams when they're designing their boards, but also what I think that means for you as potential designers of data viz in this context, or also researchers. So I developed some design principles, and they really address two main areas. First of all, the macro. So this is about the overall design of the board. And this supports a lot of the more recent findings, addressing the idea of story, structure, and narrative. The other aspect of the macro design is really about a cognitive workspace, of which which is limited for all of us. So I'm going to explain both of those principles here. So the flow and structure. This is a sketch of the photograph I showed you earlier, but it's easier to explain the flow. What I mean is that the cell leaders will have like an agenda, and they will go through their top level performance measures. So the top one here is called weekly OTIF. That stands for on time in full. And they'll review those as a team. If they need to dig down a bit more, they'll go in for the reasons for failure or quality problems and so on. And so what they're starting to do is have a supporting diagnostic type conversation. They will then refer to what they're trying to achieve in terms of their operational excellence aim and also their improvement actions. This is also informed by the strategy. So quite often in situations like this, the organization the cell may have a lot of things they could do, and they need to prioritize because they have limited resources. And this is when it's important to go back to say, what are we trying to do as an organization? And that's why it's important to have that strategy input as well. It drives the area for focus as well as what's wrong currently. And in the original work, which is referenced on the left here in 2016, we did this in a manufacturing company, and we tested it on 23 boards and then evaluated it over 18 months. We then went on further for the second reference there to test some of these principles in a laboratory setting. And what we tested was flow, status indicators like red, amber, green charts, and also format. What we found was flow was the most important. And this sits alongside the ideas of structure and narrative that we've heard about in the last few days. When we tested the RAG indicators, we did this because some companies are very keen on these and some are not so keen. And we said what we found was that it can cause people to gloss over the detail of the evidence. So you should be careful when you're using those kind of RAG indicators. And what we found with format is it basically doesn't make any difference. People tended to be happy with what they were familiar with, and there was no overriding benefit to using a table or a chart, which is interesting to us as developers of data visualizations. So An example of poor flow is shown here, and I must apologise for the slightly fuzzy photograph. Anyone who's ever been on a British train may recognise this. The reason it's fuzzy is because I was taking it on a train that was moving, and it represents how you open and close the toilet doors. The flow is poor because it starts at the top left. It then expects you to go middle right, then expects you to go bottom left, and then expects you to go middle left. So the flow is really confusing. And clearly it's a problem because there've been about 20 iterations of this same data. It would be lovely to show you them all, but I haven't spent that much time in train toilets, frankly. So this is demonstrates why flow is so important, particularly for developing insight and also to allow teams to understand what they're doing. The next aspect that I use to help people design these is about cognitive workspace. And some of you who may have a psychology background will be familiar with this idea, but essentially people can only hold about 7 things in their head at once. And beyond that, we all forget. And I know I have, and I'm sure you have been in that situation when you've just got too much on your plate. What happens? We forget things. And of course, that has implications for a visual artifact. If you try and put too much at the same level, people will just forget someone. Then you no longer have a coherent message for your teams to talk about. But I know you know more than 7 things. And what we do is we chunk them, i.e. we have kind of narratives. And then we need to use that in the way that we convey our data visualizations. So moving away from the macro, I also teach my teams about the detail. Now, I'm not going to go into that here because it's really well known amongst this audience, but these are the kind of things that we look at. One of the interesting aspects is talking about ink to data ratio, which is an idea that Tufte, who you may be familiar with, talks about. So this is about making sure that every mark you make adds data. And this brings me on to my kind of third area, which is about data density and simplicity. And there's a real challenge for us as designers of visual tools of simplicity versus relevance and how much do we squeeze in. If you ask people, they say they want it simple. What they actually mean is relevant. So Tufte also says that people like data dense graphics like maps and the ability to compare. And my experience is that this is true, particularly for frequently used data. So if you only see something once and for a short time, you've got to present it engagingly with a high impact. But for the boards that we're looking at, people use them every day regularly. So they become really familiar and you can be much more data dense. If not, it's kind of trivial and unsatisfying, a bit like a basic plan compared to a proper map. So to kind of illustrate this, I can show you what I do when I'm working with teams. So this is some fairly basic bar charts, and it shows some data over time. It shows 6 criteria, and you can see they're going up and down. And it's quite hard to kind of see what's happened. So this next chart, which is a line chart, is a more data dense plot. It has the same 6 criteria, and you can see it changing over time. However, we can simplify this on the basis that some of these aspects of this graph aren't adding anything. For instance, car park, which is at the top shown in a kind of violet color, doesn't change. So it's a redundant element. We can also see that recommend, i.e. recommending to other users, and quality echo each other. So we can remove one. Before you did that, you might want to check over a longer period of time than a year just to make sure that's so. So if we remove both of these, we can see we've only got 4 plots over time. So I've simplified, but I haven't lost any data. What it does is it gives us additional facilitated insight because we can see that queue time and quality negatively influence each other. So that means if I want to have an overall good assessment of quality, I probably need to manage my queues really well. So when you're designing these boards, this is the detail, but you need to think about what should go on the board in the first place. So think about, what do I need to know and what do I share and what am I asked about? You also need to think about the design culture, something that Johnson also spoke about. So you're looking, how frequently do people look at this board and who leads it? What's the agenda? And importantly, offline, who manages and updates? Are you making sure that you've got proper data integrity? So that just summarizes how I work with teams. And I'm going to briefly talk about some of the work that I've done moving into a digital space. So I conducted some pilot experiments looking at a digital version of the board that I showed you earlier. So we're doing problem solving here. And the experiment is a scenario. And you can see some of my colleagues here working on a large touchscreen, which is in our library. We also did the equivalent with a passive screen. And the teams have a go at problem solving, then reflect on the process. What we found was that teams got into the exercise very quickly, and it worked very similarly to a paper-based exercise. But the hardware in both cases made a difference. The touchscreen was too slow. And unfortunately, that meant that one member of the team had to drive a laptop, and that meant that they were out of the loop. So I also did some work in a pilot looking at in the construction industry. And what I found was the analog, i.e. paper-based, had better accessibility and better eye contact. But access to printers and data integrity was a problem. Whereas in digital, you had the advantage and flexibility of size of data and data integrity. But there were issues around around hardware and interoperability between different organizations. So these are my ongoing projects. We're looking at the use of visual tools in maternity services, and we'll be publishing quite soon on that. We're also looking at the use of visual tools in supply chains, and I'll be definitely following up on Johnson's work in this area. And we're also looking at moving from analog to digital tools with a couple of pieces of work, surveying, and also looking at working alongside people as they change. So my summary for practitioners is narrative and flow and structure are the most important thing. But there's lots of evidence out there in the research that you can help drive your designs. For researchers, I know there's a few out there, this is a very diverse field, and it made me think maybe we should have an academic version of Outlier so that we know what else is going on. Also, that we have to search wide and far from our home disciplines to get some really good data. So I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much. And I will hand back over to the main conference.
So as you think about the work that you've done across different sectors and spaces, I think one of the interesting things you showed was some of the kind of paper-based visualizations and some of the ways in which you've talked about boards and making things visible in those spaces. As you think about that evolution of moving over into digital spaces, is there anything you miss from doing things on paper?
Just the ability to grab a pen. So one of the previous researchers that I mentioned, Bresciani, they spoke about this idea of modifiability and perceived finishedness. And sometimes when something's shown on the screen and it's very beautiful, people think it's kind of distant from them and they can't interact with it. Whereas a bit of paper, you can grab a pen and you can start to annotate that, is a really important part of, first of all, engaging with the data, but also problem solving as well.
That's an interesting reflection. Here in the front, we've got a question.
Hi, it's Lucas. Less of a question, more of a remark, is like, when you talked about these physical visualizations, right, and the team meetings up in front of them and discussing them together, it came to me, yeah, that's such a good idea. Why don't I do this also with digital, with my stakeholders? So that's one of my takeaways. Like a dashboard that I have, can't we do like a weekly meeting, sit in front of it together, like maybe with diverse, like the PM in my case, and members of the product team, and then look at the data together and see what we find. It's such a good idea. I don't know why it hasn't occurred to me yet. So it's also applicable. Yeah.
You'll find it already exists actually in the software development field through the Scrum approach.
Mm-hmm.
True.
Yeah, and I think it resonates too with some of the ways in which the impact team meetings happen as well, that you can see how that works across cultures and spaces, that just creating the space for that conversation and saying, click here, drill down here, also gives some great usability testing for any of us who design the dashboards to see if people can find what they want. Other reflections or questions for Dr. Bateman? Yes? Oh, sorry, here over the side, then off to the front.
Hi, thank you. Thank you very much for the talk. It was really, really insightful. I wanted to ask you about what can I do to improve or evaluate a visualization work that has been previously done? Because we have spoken about like thinking through a new one, but in my case, I'm facing a reconstruction of a previously done work. So what would you do in that case? Any advice?
Well, I have one specifically for you and one generally for people who are devising boards like this. So I'm going to go with the general one first. So generally, whenever you're doing a board, you should hardwire in a review system. So when you first start it, you'll probably want to review it fairly quickly over the first 2 or 3 months. But then you need an annual review to make sure it's still meeting the needs of your team. For you as a specific, when you've got a board already, is I would think what the purpose of the board is. And then have a look if it's achieving that purpose. So, and then you can just talk to people, but you can also be an observer and make notes. So when we did our very first piece of research, I observed 15 of the team using the boards. And then I went on to interview some of those team leaders based on my observations. And we were also able to take, so the purpose of the boards was to do continuous improvement activities, so actions effectively. So what we looked at was those boards that had the most improvements, were obviously the boards that were most engaged with. So you can observe and talk to people, and from that basis then say, okay, this is how we're going to update, because you need to think about the needs of the users, but also what you're trying to achieve by having that board.
Great, thank you. Up here in front.
Hi, my name is Istvan. As you showed the photo of the board with the printed out visualizations, what really struck me was just the incredible amount of real estate that you have available in a physical space. And what I wanted to ask is, when you were experimenting with taking that over into a digital format, did you have to change the structure and the flow in any way to accommodate a smaller screen, or were there any challenges associated with that?
Well, in fact, in electronic format, one of the advantages is you can change the real estate to meet your needs. There are lots of kind of software packages that help you do that, and they're effectively infinite in size. Obviously, going from a flat format into a screen format is very different, because the screen format enables you to embed through smart links and so on. But quite often people are looking at data through, say, on their phone or on a tablet. And obviously you do need to take that into account in your design. One of the very striking moments I remember was I was looking at a team in construction, and most of the team were looking at a big screen in a room, but they one of the other advantages of electronics, you can do it from diverse locations. And the other person coming in was actually a stonemason who was up the side of a skyscraper installing a gargoyle, and he was complaining about the quality of the grout. And he was able to show a picture of the grout to the team who were involved in kind of getting the grout there for him as well. So obviously you have to take account of that, and people will always want to look at things in convenient formats like this, like a tablet or a phone, and that does mean that you will have problems in showing complex, detailed data.
Great. Any other questions from the audience here in person? Here, down in the front.
Hello, this is Michael. I work in tech, so I have lots of visceral feelings about Jira and other product management tools. But one of the things Jira, especially more than some of the other tools, like enables is for larger teams to sort of create this layering effect where there are executive dashboards in addition to team dashboards. And something that you just mentioned about struggling to show complex data, and something you also mentioned about the RAG status indicators, making it so people gloss over details. Did you, in your research, have you come across teams that have created these higher level executive dashboards that will reduce entire projects and all their complexities into just figures and aggregations and over time analysis? And how do teams, or do you have suggestions on how to sort of combat the urge to quantify these very complex things?
Yes, yeah, my work bleeds beyond what I've shown you, which is the operational level, all the way up to a high-level executive board that you're mentioning there. And in fact, particularly with the RAG indicators, we haven't tested this yet, but my inkling is that they don't work well at this operational level, but they do work better at the higher level. When you're working, managing an organization, there is a lot of data out there, and inevitably it has to be aggregated. And this is really and that's when the RAG indicators can be quite useful, because what you want to do is focus your efforts into those areas that need attention. And this comes back to that cognitive workspace, where you've got a cognitive workspace of 7, don't have more than 7 things to look at the same time. You can then drill down according to need. But the really important thing at that top level is the ability to pull out what's important at that time. But also you will then need to think in the long term, because obviously that board level, you're planning over the next 5 or 10 years. So you need to go deal with the what's going to get us into trouble now to the where should we be in 10 years' time. And you have to kind of manage that using that cognitive workspace concept. Great.
Well, I think that takes us to our quarter to the next hour and wraps up our time with Dr. Bateman. Thank you so much for being here, being part of Outlier today, and sharing your research and your work with our community. If folks are looking to connect with you, is there a good place to do that?
Yeah, they can do it through the conference, but also you can find me on the Leicester University website. And my email is widely known.
Wonderful. We love seeing ways to bring these kind of research and practitioner communities together through DVS and Outlier. Let's give a round of applause to Dr. Bateman.